Wow, thank you, Sam and Lynn, for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be part of the Salon series. This is a big crowd. I'm a novelist. I have, on more than one occasion, spoken to groups of people who would comfortably fit in that green room. So this is awesome. My mother passed away 7 years ago, almost to the day. March 31st was the anniversary, and I was having lunch with Sam and Lynn, I guess about a week prior to the anniversary, and I got to talking to them about my mom and how this kind of crazy, unlikely story of how she met my father, and Sam said, "You got to tell that story at the Salon." So I'm blaming this all on him. He said, "You're passionate about this, you should tell the story." But I didn't have to think long about it because he was right. You know, somehow the story of how this half-Jewish refugee from Germany post-war and this nomadic Torontonian who had no fixed address really at the time he met her, how they managed to link up in Guayaquil, Ecuador, is kind of an important story because I see in it a lot of what has shaped my attitudes about home, my affection for Vancouver and for traveling, which I do a lot of, and my writing, maybe especially my writing. When I published Stanley Park, which is about a locavore chef and his sort of difficult relationship with his father, who's an anthropologist researching the homeless people that live in Stanley Park. Well, there's only one person who read that book and came to me and said, "Was that professor character inspired by your father at all?" And that was my brother, so he kind of had an inside track. But what my brother didn't get is that it was actually also that this person who's so consumed with roots and rootlessness combined was also very much inspired by my mother. Now I have to do technology. There he is. My dad was what you would call a classic nomad. He's in Toronto in this picture, but he's dying to get out of there. He's what you see in his expression there is like a mixture of restlessness and ambition. He's about to go to the Mediterranean and hunt German U-boats for a while, but there's literally tens of thousands of pre-airliner travel ahead of him after that. He's going to go back to Toronto. Then he's going to go to the Philippines for a while. He's going to go to Hong Kong, down through Southeast Asia. He'll be in Sri Lanka, and then Salon for a while, through the Suez, the Mediterranean again, Marseille, Paris, Madrid, Barcelona, before he makes his way back to Toronto, and he's still bored, and he's still restless. And I sort of imagine him, he's sitting in his office one day, and he realizes that there's only one continent he hasn't visited yet, and that's South America, and he goes home and he packs that afternoon. And so in the movie version of this story, it's just the young man galloping up the gangplank with his duffel bag, and there's the knife of the bow of the ship cutting through the waves, and there's my dad on the forecastle, all his anxieties sloughing away in the salty air. So prisoners becoming nomads and refugees becoming settlers, that's really what my story is all about. Now my mother did not have my dad's problems. She didn't have the fidgets, the heebie-jeebies. My mother had much more serious problems. Born in the wrong place at the wrong time is how you would describe this. A half-Jewish person born 3 years before Hitler took the Reichstag. She spent the war in hiding, and by the time she got out, everything connected with the concept of home had been completely destroyed. Her home was gone. Her parents, her family had been dispersed. She and her mother and her sister made their way to Paris, courtesy of the International Refugee Organization, where they lived in an apartment above a brothel, which she remembered actually very fondly because the madam sort of took care of them and put her wing around them and fed them baguettes and fresh tomatoes. She sailed across to her new home in 1948 on a ship called the Marco Polo. And in the movie version of this part of the story, I don't see my mother standing on the forecastle somehow. I see her sitting on the stern, watching her life kind of go up and disappear in the wake. She went to Caracas, where the air smelled like flowers, and Barranquilla, where it didn't, apparently, where the shanty town stretched up the hillside, through Panama, down around the corner there, past the Isla de Puña, and around into Guayaquil Harbor, where she was reunited with her father, who had left Germany 8 years before. And my grandfather, who kept a diary, wrote on that day, he said, "They're here, they're well, all is well." But to the 18-year-old girl working in a bookstore in Guayaquil here, all was not well. I happen to know this because I asked her. And what she's thinking here is, what in the world is going to become of me? I was a kid, I traced their journeys on the globe. We had National Geographic globe with the light bulb inside, and I traced them. They both went the same direction, like they were chasing each other or running away from each other. You couldn't quite figure it out. And in 1948, at one point, they were on almost exactly opposite sides of the globe. My mother was in Guayaquil. My dad was in the South China Sea. He was sailing a surplus minesweeper from Subic down to Manila. And he'd just come around the corner there, turned up north past Corregidor, and it was late at night, and they discovered that the harbor was full of wreckage from the war. So my dad is on the forecastle in this tableau as well, except he's down on his belly with a flashlight, and he's shining it into the water, and he's shouting back to the wheelhouse, port, starboard, stop, and making his way through. So how do these people meet? How is this possible? They were so far apart on the planet Earth that they couldn't have been further apart unless they left the planet. And yet somehow it did happen. Somehow that nomad made his way all the way around and ended up sitting in a house party in Guayaquil, wondering where all the pretty girls were. And this one walked in. The prisoner wants to be free, so he roams. The refugee wants to settle, and so she seeks her home. The twin freedoms there, I think, are what they demonstrated to me. The freedom that puts roots under your feet, and then the other freedom that puts your hair. So we settled down, 1965, West Vancouver. We lived in Venezuela up to that point, so this was a bit of a shock. 5 kids, 13 pieces of luggage. My mother gave my 2 elder brothers sedatives, which was 60s era best practices on how to travel with feisty boys. So the doctor didn't mention that these things sometimes go like radically the other direction. So 20 hours in airplanes, my brother's wandering up and down the aisle like the town drunks. We got to Vancouver, we lived in a motel, then we lived out in Burnaby. All told, it was 217 days in transit before the Volkswagen Beetle that all 7 of us were in, pulled up to the house in West Vancouver, not far from Whitecliff, where we were gonna finally call it home. And tucking us into bed that night, I somehow can only imagine the existential relief that my parents must have felt, to finally have this roof over their heads, this permanent roof. But however they felt, I didn't feel that way. I'd kept my peace for 217 days. I was 2 years old, please. And that night, I started wailing. And I kept wailing the next night and the next. I took breaks during the day to eat, apparently. But otherwise, I kept wailing. And at the end of a week, I stopped wailing and I fell asleep. All right, I'm letting you in on something here, folks. As you can see, I was no worse for the wear. But when I look at these last pictures, I know that I'm stamped somehow. It took some tears, it took some travel, but there's the nomad settler in the making. Vancouver is my town, and I hold on to it tightly, and I only let go every chance I get. Dubai, Igloolik, Trancoso, Sichuanbana, Shangri-Las is the last year or so of my life. I'm leaving for Los Angeles tomorrow. How do I feel about this? Well, I have to go. I have stories to write. I want to be there just as I want to return. I guess you could say I've never met a place I didn't like to come home from. Of course, I'm just waiting here. I'm waiting for all this to happen, these experiences, these words all in potential, lined up there, waiting to live. Thanks to my father, thanks to my mother. Thanks to all of you, and enjoy the evening.